Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today, really deep into some pretty intense ideas. But as always, we're going to break it all down in a way that makes sense, in a way that actually matters to you. So, ready to jump in?
Absolutely. And today we're tackling one of the most influential and, frankly, challenging thinkers of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, yeah. Not exactly light reading, is he? We're looking at excerpts from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of his most well-known and debated works. And trust me, this isn't your typical dry philosophy. It's full of vivid imagery, thought-provoking pronouncements, and sometimes, yeah, you can feel like a real punch in the gut, especially when he's taking aim at, well, pretty much everything we tend to hold dear.
He doesn't pull any punches, that's for sure. But that's part of what makes him so compelling. He forces us to confront those big, uncomfortable questions about how we live, what we believe in, and what it really means to be human.
Exactly. And that's the whole point of this deep dive, right?
Mm.
We're not just trying to understand what Nietzsche's saying on the surface. We want to grapple with the potential impact these ideas can have on how you see the world, and maybe even more importantly, how you see yourself. So let's get started with one of Nietzsche's most famous and often misunderstood concepts, the Superman, or as it's written in German, the Übermensch.
Right off the bat, Nietzsche throws down this gauntlet. Mankind is something to be surpassed. He's not messing around.
Wow. I mean, just think about that for a second. Mankind, everything we are, everything we've accomplished, it's all just a stepping stone to something greater. What does that even mean for us right here, right now?
That's the million-dollar question. And to illustrate his point, Nietzsche draws this analogy between the evolution from ape to human and the potential for human to Superman. Just like humanity evolved beyond its earlier primate form, he envisions the Superman as this future being who transcends the current limitations of humankind, both the ones we place on ourselves and the ones society imposes on us.
So it's not just about being like morally better or anything. It's about reaching a whole new level of existence.
Exactly. It's about going beyond the familiar, the comfortable, and embracing a radical transformation of what it means to be human. And the really crucial point here is that Nietzsche sees this as an active process, something we strive for, something we create, rather than something that just passively happens to us.
So he's saying, will humanity just stagnate, maybe even regress, or will we actively choose to reach for this transcendence? I mean, it really makes you think about the direction we're heading, both individually and as a society. And what's interesting is how Nietzsche links this upward striving to certain types of dedication.
Mm.
He talks about this deep love for those who dedicate their lives to knowledge, to building a better world, for the Superman. But then he also brings up this will to downgoing, this idea of constant self-overcoming.
That's one of the most fascinating and maybe initially confusing parts of Nietzsche's philosophy. This will to downgoing sounds kind of negative, right? But what he really means is this willingness to constantly challenge ourselves, to shed those parts of ourselves that hold us back, whether they're old habits, limiting beliefs, or even comfortable but ultimately unfulfilling relationships.
So it's not about self-destruction. It's about actively choosing to let go of things that no longer serve us, to make room for growth and transformation.
Exactly. And Nietzsche actually sees this as a really positive, life-affirming process. He talks about how he prefers a single strong virtue to a bunch of weaker ones because he thinks that focused, intense dedication to self-mastery is far more potent.
And then he throws in this really compelling image of the lavish soul. It's this picture of someone who gives freely and generously without expecting anything in return. I mean, it's kind of a radical way to think about giving, right?
Absolutely. But what's even more insightful is how Nietzsche connects this generous spirit back to the will to downgoing. He says that by giving, by creating and setting new values, individuals are actively participating in their own transformation, in their own journey of surpassing themselves.
So giving becomes this outward expression of our inner growth.
Precisely. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Nietzsche doesn't just present this idea of the Superman in isolation. He contrasts it with this really sharp critique of existing values, and this figure he calls the last man. And he starts by talking about a weariness of wisdom, where knowledge doesn't lead to greater understanding or fulfillment, but to a kind of complacent resignation. It's almost like the pursuit of knowledge becomes just another form of comfort, rather than a catalyst for change.
So the wise become fools in their own way.
In a sense, yes. And this is the breeding ground for the last man, whom Nietzsche considers the most contemptible being imaginable.
Contemptible, why? What makes this last man so bad?
Well, for Nietzsche, the last man represents the complete absence of higher aspirations. He only wants comfort, avoids anything challenging or uncomfortable, and subscribes to this one herd, no shepherd mentality. Basically, he just wants to blend in, follow the crowd, and avoid anything that might rock the boat.
So it's this total rejection of individuality and striving, like just being content with the bare minimum.
Exactly. And what really gets to Nietzsche is that the last man fears anyone who's different, anyone who dares to want more, to strive for something beyond basic comfort and security. And he paints this really bleak picture of these last men just like obsessing over their little pleasures and their health, living lives that are completely devoid of any real meaning or purpose.
It's kind of a chilling image, isn't it? And he contrasts this with the good and just, who actually hate anyone who tries to break their tables of values, the creators, the innovators, the people who are actually trying to move things forward.
Right, because for Nietzsche, it's these breakers who are essential for creating new values, for paving the way for the Superman. The good and just, clinging to their static, often inherited morals, become obstacles to progress, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
So he's really rooting for the disruptors here, the people who are willing to challenge the status quo. And this brings us back to one of Nietzsche's central themes, the importance of self-overcoming and personal transformation. He describes these three metamorphoses of the spirit: the camel, the lion, and the child. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So initially, the spirit takes the form of a camel, representing the capacity for hard work, resilience, and reverence for tradition. This is where we learn the rules, we internalize the Tao shouts of our upbringing and our culture.
We're carrying the weight of expectations like a beast of burden.
Right. And then we move to the lion stage, where the spirit becomes strong, independent, and rejects the old imposed values. It roars no to the last master, breaking free from the constraints of tradition and authority.
So the lion is like the revolutionary, right? The one who overthrows the old regime. But then Nietzsche says even the lion can't create new values. That's where the child comes in.
Exactly. The child symbolizes a fresh start, innocence, playfulness, and the potential for true creation. It's in this stage that we can establish new values, joyfully affirm our own will, and begin a new cycle of becoming. The child doesn't say no like the lion, it says yes to its own unique possibilities.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like this progression from obedience to rebellion to ultimately self-creation. But Nietzsche also talks about the terrifying assumption of claiming the right to establish new values. It sounds like a huge responsibility.
It is. It takes immense courage and self-belief to challenge deeply ingrained norms and to create your own path. And Nietzsche even suggests that conflict and competition are necessary parts of this process.
So even virtues can clash.
Exactly. He sees it as a kind of dynamic tension that ultimately leads to the creation of stronger, more resilient values. Now, Nietzsche also has some pretty radical things to say about the afterlife and the role of the body in our earthly existence. He starts by talking about this initial delusion beyond man, this yearning for something transcendent, but then comes to this realization that the ego, with all its contradictions and imperfections, actually reveals the most authentic truth about who we are.
So he's rejecting those traditional ideas about heaven and the soul.
He is. He's saying that our focus should be on this life right here, right now. He sees the body, this physical, tangible self, as the very foundation of meaning and value creation. He even talks about a new pride in embracing our earthly head, the part of us that actively engages with and gives meaning to our existence on this planet.
It's like a complete reversal of the traditional hierarchy of body and soul.
Exactly. And he criticizes those who look down on the body, suggesting that their contempt actually masks a deep, albeit inverted, respect for its power. He argues that the creating self, this embodied will that drives us, is responsible for both our admiration and our disdain, our pleasure and our pain.
So it's all part of the same package.
Yes. And ultimately, Nietzsche says the self doesn't just want to survive, it wants to create something that extends beyond itself. And this brings us to another of his core concepts, the will to power.
Okay, what exactly does he mean by that? It sounds a little, I don't know, aggressive.
Well, it's not about aggression in the traditional sense. Nietzsche defines the will to power as this fundamental drive for growth, overcoming obstacles, exerting influence, and yes, creating. He sees it as the energy that propels all living things.
So it's not just about staying alive. It's about striving, expanding our capabilities, leaving our mark on the world.
Exactly. And Nietzsche argues that even when we seem to value things that go beyond survival, like truth, beauty, or self-sacrifice, It's ultimately the will to power expressing itself through those values. It's the force shaping our desires and driving our actions, even when those actions might seem contradictory.
That's a pretty radical idea. And it connects to his views on truth and morality, which are also pretty unconventional. He says that every culture develops its own language of good and evil, and that these value systems often clash when different groups interact.
Right. He doesn't believe in some universal objective morality. For him, morality is a product of culture, history, and the will to power. He calls these systems law tablets, and they represent a people's core values and aspirations.
Yet he's really critical of people who talk about things they don't truly understand, contrasting them with the fool who at least knows enough to avoid bad company.
Exactly. He values genuine understanding and lived experience over empty pronouncements. And in personal relationships, he elevates the concept of the friend above the mere neighbor, seeing true friendship as this kind of festival of the earth, a celebration of shared striving and mutual inspiration.
So the friend is like a prototype for the Superman.
You could say that. And Nietzsche's also pretty tough on poets and soothsayers. He famously says that the poets lie too much because they project their own emotions onto nature and create these idealized images of gods and heroes.
So he sees them as peddling escapism rather than truth.
In a way, yes. And the soothsayer's proclamation, all is alike, nothing is worthwhile, knowledge strangles, actually resonates with Zarathustra's own feelings of weariness at one point. It's like this moment of confronting the potential meaninglessness of existence.
And that leads us to one of Nietzsche's most mind-bending concepts, the eternal recurrence.
Yes, this idea that everything that has happened and will happen repeats itself infinitely in the exact same sequence forever. It's a truly daunting thought.
I can imagine. It's almost too much to bear. And Nietzsche uses this image of a shepherd biting off the head of a serpent that's crawled into his mouth and then laughing. What's going on there?
It's a pretty intense image, right? But it represents this radical self-affirmation that's necessary to embrace the eternal recurrence. It's about confronting the most terrifying possibilities and finding a way to not just accept them, but to actually laugh in their face.
Wow. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Nietzsche also talks about giving virtue and describes a type of love that compels all things to flow towards it, not to take, but to give back. He even calls it healthy and sacred selfishness. It's a pretty different way of thinking about selfishness, right?
It is. It's not about greed or self-centeredness. It's about having so much abundance, so much love that you can't help but give it away. He contrasts this with sickly selfishness, which is always taking, always needing, and never truly giving.
And he says that this giving love transcends even forgiveness and pity, and he even warns against pity. He says that even God's love for humanity was seen as a potential hell. That's a pretty provocative statement.
Yeah. Nietzsche sees pity as potentially weakening, as something that can keep people trapped in dependency rather than empowering them to overcome their own challenges.
So it's about fostering strength and self-reliance.
Exactly. And Nietzsche's ultimate message is this powerful call to become what you are. He emphasizes the importance of self-discovery, a journey that involves confronting your own inner demons, your seven devils. It's not about being conventionally good, but about realizing your full potential, even the parts of yourself that you might not like at first.
So it's about self-acceptance as much as self-improvement.
Absolutely. And he talks about the need to burn yourself in your own flame to be reborn anew. It's a metaphor for the transformative power of confronting your own limitations and letting go of old patterns.
And throughout all of this, he places a high value on honesty, even though he admits that it's a rare and often misunderstood quality. And finally, he points toward this ideal of joyful wisdom, a deep understanding of life that embraces laughter and transcends envy. He even talks about laughter as a crown. What do you think he means by that?
I think it represents a kind of triumph over the seriousness and the suffering of life. It's about finding a way to laugh, even when things are tough, to find joy in the midst of adversity.
So it's like this ultimate affirmation of life, even with all its imperfections.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We've covered a lot of ground, from the Superman to the last man, from self-overcoming to the will to power, from the eternal recurrence to joyful wisdom. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's worth it.
Absolutely. Nietzsche challenges us to think differently about ourselves, about the world, and about what it means to live a truly meaningful life. And I think the best way to end this is by leaving you with a few questions. Which of these ideas resonated most with you? How might they influence your own journey of self-discovery? What tables of values are you holding on to, maybe even unconsciously? And what would it mean for you to break them in service of becoming who you truly are? This deep dive is just a starting point. I encourage you to explore Nietzsche's work further and see where it takes you. Thanks for joining us.